In the remote wilderness of Maine, 3 women have run what appears to be a religious sanctuary for more than 3 decades. 600 women have entered the sanctuary in hopes of finding spiritual healing. Fewer than half have ever returned, and those who have not been the same. In the Maine State Archives, one survivor's testimony exists so haunting that officials kept it secret for more than a century. Tonight we reveal what really happened behind the stone walls of the Monastery of Eternal Tears. Before we continue with the chilling tale of the Abbey of Eternal Tears, it's important to make it clear that this channel is not for everyone. It's for the bravest of souls, those who dare to face the darkest chapters of American history. If you're brave enough to uncover the truths hidden in the shadows of the past, please subscribe and let us know which state you're listening from. Are you brave enough to join the community of true mystery hunters? Let's dive in. What makes this story truly chilling isn't religious fanaticism or the supernatural. There's something far more sinister behind it, a cold thirst for knowledge, masked as Christian charity. In the late 18th century, Maine was still part of Massachusetts, a wilderness where isolated communities struggled to survive harsh winters and harsher realities. The coastal town of Millbridge, with a population of fewer than 300, served as a transit point for lumber merchants and fishermen, brave enough to brave the fierce Atlantic waves. 15 miles inland through dense forest, with only faint traces of Aboriginal hunting trails, lies a land that will forever be associated with unspeakable horrors. On a grey October morning in 1798, 3 Ashford women arrived in Millbridge. Their carriage was laden with mysterious wooden crates and strange medical equipment, drawing curious onlookers. Mother Agatha Ashford stepped out first, European aristocratic in every gesture. She was a striking woman in her 40s, with silvery brown hair and cold grey eyes that seemed to analyze everything around her. Her voice was the standard accent of the English intelligentsia, and her manner was that of someone accustomed to absolute power. Next came Sister Prudence Ashford, a tall, thin woman of about 30, with a skin as pale as wax and hands that moved with the precision of a master craftsman. Her fingers were long white and unusually calm, something that would prove so important in the grisly work. Unlike the abbess, Prudence spoke very little. Her pale blue eyes were lifeless, and her voice, when she did speak, had a soft, cold Scottish accent that sent shivers down the spines of bordermen. The youngest of the 3 was Sister Temperance Ashford, a novice in her early 20s. Her beauty was haunting. Her hair was jet black. Her skin was porcelain, and her eyes were dark and mysterious. But her beauty was also unsettling, a feeling that made mothers instinctively pull their children closer whenever she passed. Her smile never reached her eyes, and her habit of observing others as if they were experimental specimens was unnerving. The 3 Ashford sisters claimed to be Anglican nuns fleeing religious persecution in their homeland, with the goal of founding a new monastery in the American wilderness. They carried with them impressive letters of introduction from Church of England officials, documents that later proved to be elaborate forgeries. In the remote wilderness of Maine, 3 women ran what looked like a religious sanctuary. For over 3 decades, 600 women entered its gates seeking spiritual healing. Fewer than half ever made it home, and those who did return came back different. Buried deep in the Maine State Archives is the testimony of a lone survivor, so disturbing that officials kept it sealed for over 100 years. Tonight we uncover what truly happened behind the stone walls of the Convent of Eternal Tears. But before we dive deeper into the story of the Convent of Eternal Tears, a warning. This channel isn't for everyone. It's only for those bold enough to confront the darkest chapters of American history. If you have the courage to uncover what lurks in the shadows of our past, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us which state you're listening from. Are you brave enough to join a community of true mystery seekers? Let's find out. What makes this story especially chilling isn't religious fanaticism or tales of the supernatural. It's something far more unsettling. The cold, calculated pursuit of knowledge, no matter the human cost, hidden behind a mask of Christian charity. In the late 1700s, the District of Maine was still part of Massachusetts, a rugged frontier where scattered settlements struggled to endure brutal winters and even harsher realities. The coastal village of Millbridge, home to barely 300 souls, was a humble outpost for lumber traders and fishermen who dared brave the Atlantic's unforgiving tides. 15 miles inland, beyond dense forests and forgotten Native American hunting trails, lay a remote stretch of land that will one day become synonymous with horror. On a grey October morning in 1798, the Ashford women arrived in Millbridge. Their horse-drawn wagon was stacked with peculiar crates and medical equipment that drew curious stares from the locals. Mother Superior Agatha Ashford stepped down. First a woman with the bearing of European aristocracy. She appeared to be in her early 40s, with silver-streaked auburn hair and piercing grey eyes that seemed to scan and catalogue every detail of her surroundings. Her voice carries the polished accent of Britain's educated elite, and everything about her demeanour suggests she was used to absolute authority. Following her was Sister Prudence Ashford, a tall, angular woman in her 30s, with alabaster skin and hands that moved with the precise elegance of a master artisan. Her fingers were long, pale, and eerily steady, an ability that would later prove crucial to her grisly work. Unlike her superior, Prudence rarely spoke. She viewed the world through pale blue eyes that betrayed nothing. When she did speak, her voice held the lilt of a soft Scottish accent, refined but with a cold undercurrent that unsettled even the most hardened frontiermen. The youngest of the trio was novice Temperance Ashford, barely past the age of 22. She possessed an unsettling beauty, raven black hair, porcelain skin and dark eyes that seemed to hide ancient secrets. Yet, her appearance stirred unease. There was something about her that made mothers instinctively pull their children closer. Her smile never touched her eyes, and she had the unnerving habit of watching people as if they were specimens in a collection jar. The Ashford women claimed to be Anglican nuns fleeing religious persecution in England, hoping to find a new order in the American wilderness. They carried impeccable letters of recommendation from respected English church officials, documents later exposed as brilliant forgeries. This story proved convincing enough to win over the Protestant community of Millbridge, who welcomed the presence of educated religious women as a much-needed civilizing force in their rugged frontier town. Backed by what seemed like an endless supply of gold coins, the sisters purchased nearly 200 acres of secluded forest from a grateful widow, burdened by her late husband's debts. The price they paid 3 times the land's evaluated value raised suspicions, but it also guaranteed enthusiastic support from local officials. Wasting no time, the sisters employed every available carpenter mason and laborer in the region to begin building their religious retreat. Over the next 8 months, a structure rose from the wilderness that defied all expectations of what a house of God should look like. Constructed from grey stone quarried along the nearby coast, the building stands 3 stories tall, its thick walls designed to silence any sound from within. The windows were oddly small and placed high along the walls, making it impossible to peer inside from the ground. Strangest of all was the basement level, which required extensive excavation and reinforced foundations far beyond what was necessary for simple storage. When questioned about the unconventional architecture, Mother Superior Agatha simply smiled and replied with calm assurance. Penitent requires solitude, and solitude demands proper containment. Our sisters in England have learned that true spiritual healing is only possible when the penitent is fully removed from worldly distractions. Most listeners accepted her explanation, though a few older laborers quietly questioned why a place of worship looked so much like a fortress. The Ashford women oversaw every stage of construction with obsessive precision, insisting on unusual design features that leave the builders puzzled. Reinforced doors with heavy iron locks, drainage systems capable of handling massive liquid volumes, and complex ventilation shafts that seemed better suited for a medical facility than a convent. When asked about these oddities, the sisters confidently cited their experience with European religious institutions, claiming such features were standard for intensive spiritual rehabilitation. Their answers were calm, practiced, and just credible enough. One of their earliest and most enthusiastic supporters was Dr. Samuel Hartwell, a traveling physician in his 50s, known throughout frontier settlements for his progressive ideas. From his first meeting with the sisters, Dr. Hartwell was taken aback by their apparent knowledge of women's mental health. Their understanding of female hysteria and melancholia surpasses that of most trained doctors of the era. In his journal, he wrote, "The sisters possess astonishing insight into the nature of feminine psychological distress. Although their methods are conventional, they are based on principles I believe are decades ahead of American medicine. They aim to address root causes of mental imbalance rather than just the surface symptoms." What he left out of that journal entry, however, was the private conversation he had with Mother Superior Agatha that same day. In exchange for referring complex mental cases to the convent and supplying medical goods through his network, Dr. Hartwell was offered a generous monthly payment and exclusive access to detailed case files that could greatly enhance his professional reputation. For a frontier physician, barely scraping by it was an offer he couldn't afford to turn down. The reputation of the convent spreads through the territory with astonishing speed. From distant settlements in Portsmouth, Portland, and even as far as Boston, families began to hear hushed rumors, stories of the Ashford sisters and their miraculous ability to reform difficult women into paragons of virtue. The price was steep: $20 silver for a month of treatment, $50 for a 3-month stay, and $100 for what they call complete reformation. But for desperate families burdened by scandalous daughters or hysterical wives, it seemed a small price to pay for peace and the restoration of social respectability. The women sent to the Convent of Eternal Tears were a reflection of the era's deep-rooted fears about female behavior. Unwed mothers who refused to name the fathers of their children were locked away alongside wives who had openly denied their husbands' authority. Rebellious daughters who refused arranged marriage shared quarters with women whose only offense was a passion for books, ideas, or politics. Their only common trait? Defiance. each woman had, in her own way, dared to step outside the rigid constraints of 19th century femininity. Religious divisions of the time also played a role in the convent's admissions. Puritan families sometimes sent daughters who had shown an interest in Anglican or Methodist beliefs, while Anglican household quietly removed daughters drawn to the ecstatic revivalism of Baptist sermons. The Ashford sisters welcomed all denominations without discrimination, insisting that their techniques transcended theological differences, united under the universal power of Christian discipline. The first sign that something was deeply wrong at the Convent of Eternal Tears came on a bitter February night in 1803. A young hunter named Thomas Brewster, just 20 years old, was tracking a wounded deer through the snow-covered forest near the convent grounds. Thomas, born and raised in the woods of Maine, was intimately familiar with every sound the wilderness had to offer: the brittle snap of icy branches, the distant cry of wolves, the wind sighing through frozen pines. But what he heard that night wasn't nature. It was unnatural, undeniably human, and deeply wrong. From somewhere beyond the trees, carried on the dense winter air, came screams. They rose and fell in disturbing waves, sometimes fading into ragged sobs, then erupting again into raw animal howls of agony. The sounds rooted Thomas to the spot, his blood cold in his veins. Abandoning the deer he had been tracking, he crept towards the towering stone convent. His every step hesitated as the noise grew louder. From the front, the building appears completely dark. But as he moved quietly toward the rear, he spotted a faint glow flickering behind basement windows, partially buried under deep snow. The closer he got, the more horrifying the sounds became alongside the screams. He now heard the metallic clatter of instruments' urgent whispers and something that sounded disturbingly like sawing. Crouching beside one of the frosted windows, Thomas dared to peek inside. What he saw would follow him for the rest of his life. The basement had been converted into something grotesque, a surgical theater, bathed in the glow of dozens of oil lamps and candles. Their light threw long, quivering shadows across the cold stone walls. At the center of the room, a woman lay, strapped to a heavy wooden table with thick leather restraints. Her head was immobilized by a cruel-looking metal frame that resembled a medieval torture device far more than any medical equipment. Standing over her, calm and precise, was Sister Prudence. Her pale face, usually expressionless, was flushed with concentration. In her steady hands, she held what looked like a long, thin metal rod. And as she moved with surgical precision, Thomas realized this was no act of healing. This was something else entirely. The woman's head was partially shaved, revealing a pale scalp etched with dark lines carefully drawn in ink. But the most horrifying detail, the one that made Thomas's stomach churn, was the unmistakable opening in her skull. Beneath the sheen of exposed bone lay something darker, pulsating brain tissue. The screaming woman's eyes bulged with terror and unbearable pain. And yet, what made the scene even more nightmarish was the cold detachment of her tormentors. Mother Superior Agatha stood nearby, calmly taking notes in a leather-bound journal, as though she were observing a routine medical experiment. Novice Temperance moved with smooth efficiency, handing surgical tools to Sister Prudence like a seasoned assistant in an operating theater. Frozen in place, Thomas watched as Prudence slowly inserted the slender metal rod deeper into the woman's exposed skull. The screaming surged to a fever pitch, echoing off the stone walls, then suddenly stopped as the patient slipped into unconsciousness. But the sisters did not pause. They continued their work in eerie silence, their movements measured and emotionless, seemingly unaffected by the woman's sudden unresponsiveness. Thomas couldn't bear to watch another second. He tore himself away, stumbling through knee-deep snowdrifts, heart-racing mind spinning in blind panic. The image of that candlelit chamber will never leave him, the mechanical precision of the procedure, the icy professionalism of the women involved, and worst of all, the unmistakable certainty that this was not the first time it had happened. By the time Thomas reached town at daybreak, he was near hysteria. He burst into his father's blacksmith shop, ranting about brain surgery and torture chambers, with such manic energy that his father feared the boy had lost his mind. The elder Brewster, a practical, no-nonsense man who placed community order above all else, listened carefully as his son scenes that sounded like they had been torn from the pages of a gothic horror novel, rather than witnessed in a house of God. "Thomas," he said slowly, "you were hunting alone at night in a blizzard after chasing a wounded animal for hours. Under such conditions, the mind plays cruel tricks. Perhaps what you saw was a medical procedure of some sort. The sisters are known to treat women with delicate conditions. Perhaps some treatments are more intimate than we understand." But Thomas's story was too precise to dismiss as fantasy. He described the layout of the basement, the instruments in chilling detail, and most convincingly, the cold, professional way the women had carried out the procedure. This wasn't chaos or madness. It was clinical, systematic, and disturbingly practiced. Concerned but cautious, the elder Brewster decided to take the matter to Deacon Morrison, the town's most regarded elder and unofficial moral compass. Morrison was known for his sound judgment and emphasis on community harmony. The Ashford sisters had been valued members of Millbridge for over 5 years, consistently donating to local charities and maintaining a spotless public image. Several prominent families even had daughters or wives undergoing treatment at the convent. "We must tread very carefully," Deacon Morrison warned after hearing Thomas's account. "Accusations like this could destroy reputations and unravel the very fabric of our town. These women are servants of God, not criminals. Surely there's a rational explanation for what the boy believes he saw." Still, the deacon could not ignore the seriousness of the claims. He agreed to conduct a discreet visit to the convent the following week under the pretense of organizing a church fundraiser that would require the sisters' support. Mother Superior Agatha welcomed him in the convent's somber parlor, a cold, minimal space dominated by a towering wooden crucifix and religious paintings that seemed to watch his every move. She was the picture of grace and composure, showing no trace of guilt or nervousness. She poured tea and asked about his family's well-being with what appeared to be genuine warmth. When the deacon casually brought up rumors that hunters had reported strange noises coming from the convent. At night, Agatha's reaction was calm, even understanding. "We often hold late-night prayer sessions for our most afflicted residents," she explained in her refined English accent. "The process of spiritual purification can be vocal, especially for women whose lives have been steeped in sin and moral decay." She elaborated further, speaking with gentle sadness. Many of their patients, she mentioned, arrived in a state of profound spiritual torment, possessed by the demons of pride, lust, and rebellion. These inner evils fight back violently when exposed to the light of Christian discipline. What your hunters likely heard, she said with a serene smile, were not screams of pain, but the howls of demons being cast out. The explanation was delivered with such calm conviction and theological nuance that Deacon Morrison found himself nodding in agreement. The idea of spiritual warfare was deeply ingrained in the frontier faith, and within that framework, the notion that particularly corrupted souls might require intense intervention for salvation didn't seem unreasonable. If anything, it sounds compassionate, firm, but merciful. Mother Superior Agatha then graciously offered to give him a tour of the convent's upper floors. She led him through simple but spotless dormitory rooms where several women sat in complete silence. Some knelt in prayer, others sat cross-legged in meditation. On the surface, the atmosphere was serene, almost holy. But as Deacon Morrison observed more closely, he began to notice unsettling details. The residents didn't seem merely calm, they seemed muted, moving with a robotic precision as if their movements were being guided by something outside of themselves. When he tried to catch their eyes, they didn't meet his gaze. Instead, they looked straight through him, their focus fixed on something distant and unseen. When he inquired about visiting the basement levels, Mother Superior Agatha demurred with a gentle smile. That area, she explained, was reserved for intensive spiritual counseling sessions, reserved for the most afflicted cases. I'm afraid it would be inappropriate for a man to testify such deeply personal procedures, she said with practiced modesty. Some of our treatments for feminine spiritual corruption involve vulnerable explorations of the soul that would compromise a patient's dignity in the presence of male eyes. Given the customs of the time, the explanation makes sense. Deacon Morrison left the convent convinced that young Thomas Brewster had misunderstood what he had seen. Yet as his horse-drawn carriage rumbled back toward town, an unease settled over him that he couldn't quite name. A subtle wrongness had lingered in the air, too faint to call out directly, but impossible to forget. He kept thinking of the women's faces, expressionless, vacant, too still. Their movements reminded him not of prayerful devotion, but of something far more unnatural. Sleepwalkers, puppets. And then there had been the smell. Not just the expected sense of antiseptics, herbal tinctures and candle wax. Beneath that was something darker, faint but unmistakable. It reminded him of the field hospital he had visited during the Revolutionary War, where the air had been thick with blood rot and human suffering. The kind of stench that clung to your clothes and buried itself in your lungs. Following Deacon Morrison's visit, the Ashford sisters quietly enhanced their security. The nighttime screams that had once echoed from the convent termination. In their place came a heavy silence, unnerving in its completeness, as though whatever happened inside now leaves no audible trace at all. Local families continued sending their wayward daughters, wives and sisters to the convent, and the Ashford women continued welcoming them with serene smiles and ever more refined promises of transformation. But some residents, especially the more observant ones, began to notice disturbing patterns. The women who returned from the convent of eternal tears didn't come back, healed or enlightened. They came back changed. Not changed in spirit, but in essence. Not redeemed, but erased. Take Mary Prescott, for example. At 19, she was one of Millbridge's most vibrant young women, sharp-witted, quick to laugh and fiercely independent. Her refusal of 3 well-positioned marriage proposals had scandalized her family and earned her a reputation as difficult. Desperate to restore their daughter's reputation, her parents enrolled her in a 6-month spiritual program at the convent, hoping it would teach her modesty and submission. When Mary returned, they were thrilled at first. The wild spark in her eyes was gone. She no longer challenged tradition, spoke back, or questioned the rules of her household. But their delight slowly curdled into confusion and fear. The daughter they had once called rebellious had become eerily obedient. Her once bright eyes were blank. She only speaks when spoken loudly. She expressed no opinions, no preferences, no dreams. Mary Prescott had been returned to them, but she was no longer the same person. Mary accepted the very first marriage proposal that came her way, not out of excitement or even resignation, but with a blank mechanical obedience. She showed no interest in the man, no curiosity about the life they would share, no joy in the occasion. At first, her parents viewed her calm compliance as a success, but as weeks went by, their pride turned to ease. Mary displays no recognition of her favorite meals or treasured possessions. Childhood toys, cherished books, and even lifelong friends meant nothing to her. When her mother showed her letters she had once written, passionate, clever notes filled with questions about the world, Mary stared at them with puzzled detachment, as if reading the handwriting of a stranger. Most unsettling of all, she seemed emotionally hollow. No laughter, no tears. Nothing brought her happiness or sadness. Her responses to life were not muted, they were absent. Dr. Hartwell, when consulting about Mary's condition, praised the outcome as a flawless success. The patient, he declared confidently, has been fully cured of the mental defects that made her unfit for marriage and motherhood. The rebellious tendencies that distressed her family have been completely eliminated through appropriate spiritual intervention. But Mary's mother noticed troubling signs. Her daughter bore strange scars on her scalp, just visible during bathing or brushing. The marks followed a deliberate pattern, far too organized to be accidental. When asked about them, Mary offered no explanation. She simply said she remembered nothing about her time at the convent, only that she had prayed very hard to become a better woman. As the convent's reputation grew across New England, similar transformations became increasingly common. Hannah Morse, a young mother grieving the death of her infant son, had been sent to the convent for melancholia. She returned 3 months later with an eerily bright smile and no memory of ever having had a child. When her husband showed her the baby's clothes and toys, she looked at them without recognition, her eyes vacant. Her heart seemed untouched by loss. But perhaps the most disturbing case was Elizabeth Thornton. The wife of a wealthy merchant, she had been committed to the convent after publicly accusing her husband of adultery and demanding a divorce, an unforgivable scandal that threatened the family's social position. When she returned after 4 months, she not only retracted her accusations, she insisted she had never made them at all. According to Elizabeth, her marriage was perfectly loving, and her husband beyond reproach. Her family, however, noticed troubling changes. Elizabeth suffered from violent headaches that confined her to bed for days. She often forgets the names of close friends and relatives. She became lost in familiar parts of town and struggled to complete simple tasks she had once performed with ease. Like Mary and the others, Elizabeth bore mysterious scars on her scalp, and like them, she claimed no knowledge of how they had been acquired. Still, Dr. Hartwell remains a fervent supporter of the Ashford methods. But those close to him began to notice a shift. As the years passed, his mood grew strange, his behavior erratic. His once celebrated brilliance clouded by obsession. The once revealed Dr. Hartwell began to spiral. He drank heavily and often argued to himself in long, rambling monologues about the advancement of science and the necessity of sacrifice for the greater good. His friends and colleagues grew increasingly concerned. But it wasn't until after his death that the full extent of his inner turmoil became known. His private journals discovered posthumously painted the picture of a man locked in battle with his conscience, justifying atrocities in the name of progress. The procedures I have testified, he wrote, violate every ethical principle I was ever taught, and yet the results cannot be denied. The sisters have achieved what European doctors only dream of: altering personality, erasing memories, reshaping behavior through precise surgical intervention in the brain. Their records are meticulous, their methods consistent, their results replicable. History will have to decide whether we were visionaries or monsters. During this period, correspondence between the convent and several European medical institutions increased dramatically. Local postal workers, generously compensated for their silence, couldn't help but notice the sheer volume of outgoing and incoming mail packages marked with foreign addresses, many from Germany, France, and Austria. The convent was receiving shipments of rare medical texts, surgical instruments, and chemical compounds, while sending out thick envelopes filled with detailed reports, and what looked disturbingly like preserved biological samples. Mother Superior Agatha began taking monthly trips to Portland, and Boston, always returning with tightly sealed crates marked fragile or hazardous. When curious locals asked about her frequent travels, she explained that the convent was at the forefront of a groundbreaking new field, an integrated approach to treating feminine mental disorders through the fusion of spiritual discipline and cutting-edge European science. Her polished demeanor and intellectual vocabulary make the story sound plausible, even admirable to a community that still believes in both divine healing and the promise of modern medicine. Yet for some, the unease only deepened. Martha Goodwin, whose daughter Rebecca had returned from the convent, profoundly altered, began speaking quietly to other families. What she uncovered disturbed her deeply. No woman who had intensive basement treatment could remember anything from their time at the convent, save for vague fragments of prayers and scripture. It was as if their entire experience had been surgically erased. Martha's quiet investigation revealed something even more alarming. Several women had never returned home at all. When their families asked for answers, the Ashford sisters replied that these women had experienced such powerful spiritual awakenings that they had chosen to remain as full-time residents of the convent. They had, it was said, taken vows of silence and permanent seclusion, renouncing all ties to their previous lives in order to devote themselves entirely to God. But when families requested visits, they were gently but firmly denied. The sisters insist that such visits would violate the sanctity of the women's vows. No one, not even parents, was permitted to disturb their holy solitude. As rumors began to spread, Martha learned that the convent was now attracting women from far beyond Maine. Wealthy families from New York, Philadelphia, and even Charleston were sending their difficult daughters to the Ashfords, often paying enormous sums for guaranteed transformation. The fees had increased to match the demand up to $500 for what was now called comprehensive reformation, a 6-month process that promised the permanent removal of all undesirable behaviors. By the time the convent entered its second decade of operation, the Ashford sisters had become recognized authorities on feminine mental health, both in America and across the Atlantic. Their reputation, carefully cultivated and reinforced by glowing testimonials and published medical correspondence, began to attract the attention of some of the most prominent doctors and researchers of the era. Dozens of prominent men in the medical field became enthralled by the detailed case studies and staggering success rates presented in the Ashford sisters' correspondence. Among their most dedicated admirers was Dr. Jonathan Whitmore of Harvard Medical School. For over 15 years, he maintains a regular exchange of letters with the convent. His preserved communications are now housed in the Harvard archives. In these letters, Whitmore often expressed astonishment at the depth and precision of the Ashfords' research. "Your documentation of behavioral modification techniques surpasses anything I've encountered in current European literature," he wrote. "The accuracy with which you link specific physical interventions to predictable personality outcomes suggests a level of understanding our profession may not reach for decades." What Dr. Whitmore never realized was that the data he so admired described what we now recognize as primitive and profoundly unethical forms of lobotomy trepanation and intentional brain injury. The Ashford sisters had developed a disturbingly advanced understanding of brain function, not through academic theory, but through unrestricted human experimentation. While respectable physicians rely on animal studies and autopsies, the sisters refine their methods directly on living repeatedly and without oversight. Their approach was horrifyingly systematic. Each patient was catalogued in detail. Personality traits, emotional tendencies, social behaviors, all logged prior to intervention. Every surgical step was meticulously recorded. Post-operative notes tracked memory changes, emotional shifts, speech patterns, and social responses with the rigor of legitimate scientific inquiry. By this point, Sister Prudence had become a master of what she chillingly referred to as targeted cranial intervention. Her anatomical illustration, discovered decades later in a hidden chamber, mapped out precise access points to specific brain regions, complete with exact measurements and angles. These drawings demonstrate not only a profound grasp of cranial anatomy, but an intention to manipulate it with terrifying precision. The procedures themselves were conducted with cold clinical efficiency. Patients were typically sedated with laudanum or other opiates, but never to the point of full unconsciousness. The sisters needed their subjects semi-alert, able to respond to questions or obey simple commands as different parts of their brains were probed and altered. Observing a woman answer a question differently, mid-procedure provided them with real-time data on what had changed. Over time, novice Temperance Ashford evolved into the convent's specialist in psychological behavioral conditioning and reconstruction. She created elaborate post-surgical programs to reinforce the changes made in the operating room. These regimens rely on carefully orchestrated reward and punishment cycles, deprivation, and psychological pressure. Her methods included regulating food and sleep, subjecting patients to extreme temperatures, and enforcing complete social isolation. breaking down the individual's original personality, then rebuilding it piece by piece. The sisters didn't stop at surgery and isolation. They were also early experimenters with chemical compounds drugs that wouldn't become available to the general medical community for decades. Using their growing network of European contacts, they acquired rare substances and tested combinations that affected memory obedience and emotional regulation. Every dose and outcome was catalogued with scientific precision. By 1815, the convent had processed more than 400 women through its so-called treatment programs. Their records claimed a success rate exceeding 90%, though success meant the complete eradication of any personality traits or behaviors that had led to the woman's commitment in the first place. Those who didn't survive the procedures were recorded as failures. Their bodies were not returned to families but preserved within the convent, stored for further dissection and study. During this period, the scale of the Ashford sisters' operation expanded dramatically. No longer content with treating only society's wayward daughters, they began accepting what they referred to as research volunteers. These were typically destitute women, prostitutes, widows, vagrants with no family, no advocates, and nowhere else to turn. In exchange for food, shelter, and a modest stipend, they agreed to participate in experimental procedures that the sisters stated would advance medical understanding of the feminine mind. But what these women actually received was not treated, it was exploited. They became test subjects in the sisters' most dangerous and untested procedures. The records of these experiments, discovered years later in hidden convent archives, reveal a level of detail and detachment that is difficult to comprehend. Each woman was measured, documented, and dissected. Her skull measurements recorded to the millimeter. Her brain's reactions to various stimuli carefully annotated, and her emotional responses tracked like data points in a laboratory ledger. What emerged from this hidden world was not just a program of unethical experimentation, but an underground empire of medical research. The sisters maintain extensive correspondence with doctors and universities across Europe and America, selling their findings to institutions unwilling or unable to conduct such work themselves. Their letters, written in code and routed through intermediaries, reveal a thriving black market in human experimentation data. The Ashford sisters were its most prolific and reliable suppliers. One of their most lucrative clients was Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna. He paid considerable sums for detailed documentation on how surgical interventions could erase specific memories, dull emotional responses, and create what he chillingly described as obedient behavioral states in female patients. Even the University of Edinburgh, ironically, the same institution that had once expelled Dr. Agatha Brennan, became an unwitting participant. Through third-party intermediaries, they purchased research material that was later incorporated into their official medical curriculum, unaware that it had originated from the remote forests of Maine and the systematic violation of human lives. What began as therapy had become custom-tailored brain modification. Wealthy families from Boston, Philadelphia, and New York began requesting specific alterations in their problematic relatives. The Ashford sisters offered personalized packages, suppression of artistic inclinations, removal of romantic attachment, reduction of intellectual curiosity, or the complete installation of domestic docility. Each desired outcome came with a specialized surgical protocol and a premium price tag. The convent, once seen as a spiritual retreat, has become a bespoke factory for reshaping women's personalities. But the sisters' carefully maintained facade, which had shielded them from scrutiny for nearly 20 years, began to show its first serious fractures in the winter of 1818. That year, a young woman named Sarah Whitman arrived at the convent, and she would ultimately prove to be their undoing. Unlike the broken and submissive women typically sent for treatment, Sarah was different. She was sharp-proud and fiercely independent. Her crime in the eyes of her family was giving birth to a child out of wedlock, and she refused, despite relentless pressure from her prominent Boston relatives, to identify the father. She did not arrive at the broken convent. She arrived defiant. Sarah's parents, wealthy Boston merchants with a pristine social reputation, had first attempted to quietly resolve their daughter's indiscretion. They arranged meetings with suitors willing to overlook the child and even considered placing the baby with a distant relative. But Sarah refused. She insisted on keeping her child and building a life on her own terms. Infuriated and humiliated, her family declared her mentally unstable and committed her to the convent of Eternal Tears, claiming she was in need of spiritual correction. But Sarah was no ordinary patient. At 24, she was intellectually formidable. Until her pregnancy, her progressive parents had proudly supported her education, exposing her to advanced texts, including medical literature, through her father's connections with Boston physicians. That background would prove vital in understanding the true horror hidden behind the convent's stone facade. From the moment she arrived, Sarah knew something was wrong. The other residents moved with eerie uniformity, their expression vacant, their behavior unnaturally subdued. She noticed the faint scars beneath their hairlines, surgical incisions partially concealed but unmistakable. Some women struggle with speech, others with memory or recognition. But the most alarming signs were psychological. Bright-spirited individuals had been transformed into hollow, obedient shells. Her training allows her to recognize what others could not or would not. These women were not healed. They were damaged, surgically altered. In her first week, Sarah underwent the convent's standard intake process, skull measurements, psychological profiling, and an exhaustive battery of physical tests. The sisters claimed it was part of spiritual assessment, but to Sarah it was clearly neurological mapping preparation for brain intervention, disguised as divine therapy. Unlike most patients, Sarah did not break. The Ashford sisters were accustomed to women worn down by guilt, abandonment, and shame, patients too fragile to resist their methods. But Sarah was sharp angry and utterly unyielding. When kindness failed, the sisters escalated to coercion. She was placed in prolonged isolation, denied food, subjected to dehydration, and exposed to relentless psychological abuse. Sister Temperance led the charge, deploying every behavioral technique she'd refined over the years: sensory deprivation, alternating heat and cold, disruption of sleep, and constant verbal attacks, meant to erode Sarah's self-worth. But Sarah refused to crumble. Instead, she observed. She committed to remember every routine, every hallway, every sister's schedule. She mapped the convent in her mind. She began writing down her discoveries on scraps of cloth and paper, using ink she fashioned from crushed berries. She stitched the notes into the lining of her clothing, carefully hidden, but ready for the moment she would escape. That moment came during a violent thunderstorm in March of 1819. The rain was relentless. Floodwaters surged into the convent's lower chambers, forcing the sisters to evacuate the basement, relocating surgical equipment, patients, and records to the upper floors. Amid the confusion, Sarah seized her chance. She slipped from her cell and began moving silently through the exposed areas of the convent areas normally forbidden to patients. What she found in the basement confirmed her worst fears. The flooding had uncovered everything the sisters had tried so hard to keep hidden. The chambers below were not simply treatment rooms. They were surgical theaters, cold, sterile, and designed for control. She found operating tables equipped with heavy restraints, the kind meant to immobilize even the strongest patient. She discovered rows of strange and unfamiliar instruments, sharp, cold, and gleaming tools clearly designed for use not in healing but in alteration. Nothing she had ever read in legitimate medical texts resembled the grotesque devices arrayed before her. But the most horrifying discovery Sarah made in the flooded basement was the wall of glass jars, rows upon rows, each containing preserved human brain tissue suspended in clear liquid. The jars were meticulously labeled with patient names, procedure dates, and chillingly clinical notes. The surgical records she uncovered confirmed her deepest suspicions. These were not isolated experiments or medical anomalies. These were intentional acts of brain mutilation, performed with cold precision and scientific curiosity. The documentation details how specific regions of the brain were removed, modified, or stimulated, followed by careful observations on how the patient's memory, personality, or emotional capacity changed. There were anatomical diagrams showing incisions, open skulls, and targeted structures. The sisters weren't simply treating mental illness. They were rewriting people's minds, stripping away identity and will under the guise of healing. But what damned them most were the letters. Locked away in filing cabinets and storage crates were bundles of correspondence from medical institutions and physicians across Europe. Sarah read them in disbelief. The tone was disturbingly casual, the content unmistakably transactional. Doctors requested data sets. Others ordered tissue samples. Some inquired about specific behavioral outcomes. Suppression of romantic inclination. Elimination of political agitation. Desire for childbearing reinforced. This wasn't medicine. It was commerce. The Convent of Eternal Tears was running an international black market in human experimentation, supplying results and samples to those who could afford it while using the hazardous as raw material. Sarah knew then that she had only days, maybe hours, before she would become the next case file in their monstrous archive. She smuggled as many documents as she could, tucking them into hidden pockets and folding them into the seams of her clothing. The moment for escape had arrived. On a moonless night in early April 1819, she made her move. Using knowledge she'd gleaned from weeks of observation, Sarah overpowered a young, inexperienced guard and slipped into the dense forest surrounding the convent. She knew the sisters would not hesitate. This wasn't just a runaway patient, she was a threat, a witness. The only person who could expose what they had spent 2 decades hiding. The manhunt began immediately. The Ashford sisters mobilized every resource at their disposal. They mentioned Sarah was a delusional, dangerous woman who had fled a safe medical facility and recruited local men under the pretense of protecting the community from a potential threat to herself or others. Armed with torches and hunting dogs, the search parties fanned out into the woods. They knew the intimate terrain. Sarah didn't. For 3 harrowing days, she fled through the unforgiving wilderness, cold, exhausted, and utterly alone. She drank from icy streams and foraged for early spring roots and edible shoots, using knowledge from childhood visits to her grandfather's logging camp. Her body was battered feet raw and bleeding skin torn by brambles, hunger gnawing at her mind. On the second night, a cold rain swept across the region. Desperate for shelter, Sarah stumbled directly into a search party. She froze. The torchlight was just feet away. But in a moment of wild clarity, she threw herself into a gully and burrowed beneath a fallen tree. She spent the rest of the night curled inside its hollowed trunk, listening to voices calling her name. Voices that weren't searching to save her, but to silence her. And yet, she endured. Just when we thought the horrors hidden in Maine's wilderness couldn't get worse, Sarah's desperate flight plunges the story into even darker territory. If this tale has you gripped, now is the time to share it with someone who lives for true mysteries and forgotten history. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories you won't believe are real, because what happens next changes everything. By the 3rd day, Sarah was nearing collapse. Her limbs were stiff, her vision blurred. The cold had taken hold of her body. Her lips cracked, her breath shallow, her muscles barely responding. The soles of her feet were torn from hours of barefoot traveling across sharp stones and tangled underbrush. She was dehydrated, disoriented, and beginning to lose consciousness. But she kept walking, one foot in front of the other, because she knew that if she stopped, if she allowed herself to rest, she would never wake up again. But Sarah's body wasn't what propelled her forward. It was her unshakable will to expose the truth. The crimes of the Ashford sisters had to be brought into the light, no matter what it cost her. She stumbled onward through pain, hunger, and sheer exhaustion until just after dawn on her 4th day in the wilderness. She crossed paths with the one person who would save her life. Joshua Meadows was a seasoned trapper checking his lines along a game trail miles outside Millbridge. When he saw a gaunt, barefoot woman emerged from the trees, clothes torn, face streaked with mud and dried blood, his first instinct was weariness. He assumed she was either a fugitive or mentally unwell until she spoke. With clarity that started him, Sarah began to describe the layout of the convent of Eternal Tears in astonishing detail, things no outsider should know. She recited the number of stairs leading to the basement chambers, described the surgical instruments she'd seen, and referenced names of women she'd seen confined in the treatment rooms. Her voice was weak, but her words were razor sharp. This was no delusion. This was testimony. Joshua listened and believed her. He gave her food and water, wrapped her in a heavy wool coat, and placed her in his wagon beneath a pile of furs. The journey back to Millbridge was slow, but every hour brought Sarah closer to safety. Still, she flinched at every sound in the forest, every rustling branch. She knew what the Ashford sisters were capable of. They had influence, money, and connections. If they find out she had escaped, let alone that she was carrying documents, she might not survive long enough to speak. On April 18, 1819, Sarah Whitman was brought into the office of Sheriff William Hawthorne in Millbridge. She was pale, trembling, and barely able to stand, but her voice was calm, controlled. Her words carried the weight of someone who had witnessed evil and lived to tell the tale. At first, Hawthorne treated her with the same cautious skepticism he applied to all wild tales from the frontier. He'd once dismissed Thomas Brewster's account as hallucination brought on by a snowstorm. Now faced with a similarly incredible story, he leans on experienced people in distress often say strange things. But Sarah wasn't raving. She was methodical. She described the convent's floor plan down to the placement of hidden storage cabinets and narrow basement passageways. She named patients no one outside the convent should know. She quoted excerpts from surgical logs word for word. And then she did something no one else had managed before. She opened her coat and produced the evidence. Water-stained, smudged, but unmistakably real, Sarah had smuggled out a bundle of documents. Surgical records, personal letters, patient files, receipts for equipment, notes in the unmistakable hand of Sister Prudence. Some were signed. All were damned. The first document Sheriff Hawthorne examined was a surgical log, its title written in perfect copperplate. At the top of the page, Cranial Intervention Studies, Phase 7. It listed 23 patients over 8 months. Each entry included the patient's name and age, their spiritual affliction, a psychological profile, and surgical notes, most of which described procedures involving the skull being opened with precision drills and instruments inserted to damage targeted areas of brain tissue. One case made Hawthorne's hands tremble. Margaret Fowler, age 19. Affliction, intellectual disobedience. Exhibits unnatural interest in literature and independent thinking, unbecoming of her station and sex. The notes detail a procedure that involves subsectional ablation of hippocampal structures with the explicit goal of reducing memory, retention, abstract thought, and critical reasoning while preserving functional aptitude in domestic tasks. In other words, they had deliberately damaged her brain to erase her intellect, but left her capable of cleaning, cooking, and child-rearing. It wasn't hearsay. It was written in the clinical hand of a surgeon who considered the destruction of a young woman's mind, pride, to be a matter of professional. Sheriff Hawthorne read on in horror. What began as skepticism became disbelief, then revulsion, and finally, anger. This was no religious retreat. It was a facility for psychological dissection. The women who went in weren't being healed. They were being erased. The post-operative notes confirm what Sarah had feared, the horrifying success of the procedure. Margaret Fowler was no longer herself. The brilliant, inquisitive girl who once challenged sermons and read philosophy for pleasure had become a blank slate. Her vocabulary was stunted. Her ability to form complex thoughts severely diminished, and her once insatiable love of learning had been erased entirely. The final line of the report reads, "Patient now displays appropriate feminine docility. Shows no interest in activities beyond basic domestic functions." It wasn't medicine. It was mutilation, masquerading as moral reform. But that was only the beginning. The second document was even more damning, a series of letters from Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna, negotiating the purchase of the Ashford sisters' experimental data. He had paid 4,000 Austrian florins, an enormous sum for detailed documentation on procedures to eliminate unwanted memories and alter personality through direct surgical intervention. Zimmermann's letters make one thing chillingly clear. The Ashford sisters were at the center of an international black market in human experimentation. Universities in Edinburgh, Berlin, and Paris had all received regular reports findings derived from unthinkable procedures that no legitimate institution could ethically perform. The convent wasn't just a hidden horror in the Maine wilderness. It was a commercial engine, trafficking in mutilated minds and selling secrets to the world's most prestigious research centers. Then came the final document, a patient catalogue, cold, clinical, and monstrously detailed. Over 600 women had passed through the Convent of Eternal Tears since 1798. Each entry includes the patient's name, condition, treatment received, and final disposition. The majority were labeled reformed and returned women who had been surgically modified and sent back to their families, now passive obedient and devoid of their former selves. A smaller number were marked permanent residents, supposedly women, who had chosen to remain and devote themselves to prayer. But their current whereabouts were unspecified and none had been seen again. Most horrifying of all, nearly 200 entries bore a single chilling word: expired. These were the women who had died during or shortly after the procedures. When Sheriff William Hawthorne finished reading, he sat in silence for several minutes. Then, without a word, he rose and began organizing a full-scale raid on the convent. This was no longer about a runaway patient or eccentric nuns. This was about systematic, institutionalized murder. He assembled 15 armed men, choosing only those he completely trusted. Messages were sent by horseback to Portland and Boston, requesting assistance from federal marshals. Hawthorne knew what he was up against. This wasn't just a crime. It was a scandal that could shake the very foundations of medicine, religion, and government. But the Ashford sisters were already gone, thanks to their network of informants in Millbridge, including doctors, merchants, and even clergy. They had been tipped off the moment Sarah's story was taken seriously. During the night, they had fled the convent, taking with them everything they could carry: surgical records, financial ledgers, research, correspondence, and the more portable instruments. When the sheriff's party arrived on the morning of May 20th, 1819, they found the convent deserted. The doors were unlocked. The fires had gone cold. A tea set remains on the parlor table, as if the sisters had only just stepped out. What remains behind is enough to haunt the town for generations. In the basement, the raiding party discovered a fully equipped surgical theater, complete with blood-stained tables, steel restraints, and tools that looked more suited to torture than healing. Along the walls were shelves, hundreds of glass jars containing preserved human brain specimens, each labeled with a patient's name date and notes on the procedure performed. Behind a false wall, they uncovered a hidden chamber. Inside, 47 bodies, some partially embalmed, others in various states of decomposition. Each one of them shows evidence of cranial surgery. These weren't forgotten patients. They were the casualties of an unholy crusade, women sacrificed on the altar of science, silenced in the name of control. The bodies had been submerged in a chemical solution, alcohol mixed with preservatives, each meticulously tagged with names, dates, and clinical summaries of the procedures performed. It was a grotesque archive not just of death, but of deliberate scientific violation. Elsewhere in the convent, the full scope of the Ashford sisters' work came into horrifying focus. File cabinets crammed with thousands of pages, surgical notes, patient records, and correspondence with physicians around the world revealed that this was not an isolated case of rogue medicine. It was a fully operational, decades-long research enterprise operating in the shadows of the Maine wilderness under the guise of divine care. The procedures documented in those files were decades ahead of their time mapping, behavior to brain regions, targeting memory centers, modifying cognition and personality with surgical precision. But their methods had bypassed every ethical boundary, every human right. They had turned suffering into science, lives into data points. When confronted with the evidence of his complicity, Dr. Samuel Hartwell, once a respected local physician, initially tried to defend himself. These women were already lost to society, he argued, voice trembling. Their conditions made them unfit for normal life. At least their pain served a purpose, one that will benefit future generations. But his rationalizations crumble under the weight of what had been revealed. The preserved bodies, the shredded minds, the lies disguised as mercy. When presented with the full scale of what the convent had done, Dr. Hartwell suffered a complete mental collapse. Under heavy guard in the Millbridge jail, he offered a final confession that shocked even seasoned investigators. The women known to the town as Mother Superior Agatha Sister Prudence and Novice Temperance Ashford were not nuns at all. They were doctors, brilliant, disgraced, and deeply dangerous. Mother Superior Agatha was, in truth, Dr. Agatha Brennan, a Scottish surgeon who had been banned from medical practice after multiple patients died during experimental brain surgeries meant to correct feminine hysteria. Sister Prudence was Dr. Prudence Ashford, expelled from the University of Edinburgh for conducting illegal surgeries on asylum patients in an effort to map neurological functions through targeted cranial damage. Novice Temperance, the youngest, had never been ordained. She was Dr. Temperance Ashford, her sister's protégée, a brilliant mind who had pioneered behavioral conditioning protocols to strengthen post-surgical compliance. The three had fled Europe in 1797, reinventing themselves as Anglican nuns to escape prosecution, and continue their research in a land where oversight was minimal and authority easy to manipulate. In the guise of spiritual reformers, they had spent more than 20 years perfecting their methods, turning the convent of Eternal Tears into a covert laboratory for human experimentation free from law ethics or oversight. The revelation ignited one of the largest criminal manhunts in early American history. Federal marshals, local sheriffs, and even European authorities joined the search. The sisters' names and descriptions were sent across borders and oceans. But they were gone, vanished without a trace. Investigators discovered that they had prepared for this moment for years. Multiple escape routes had been built into the convent. False identities, safe houses, and financial resources had all been established in advance. Bank records unearthed during the investigation showed that over the years the sisters had transferred more than $50,000, a staggering fortune at the time, to accounts in Canada, Mexico, and Europe. They had planned their disappearance as meticulously as they had their surgeries. The public outcry was immense but curiously short-lived. Although the scandal made headlines for months, it was gradually buried by a society eager to forget that such atrocities had taken place in its own backyard. The documents were quietly archived, the convent's ruins left to decay, and the survivors, those who could still speak, returned to a life of silence and shadows. Today, the tale of the Ashford sisters is often dismissed as folklore, a ghost story from Maine, a dark legend told around campfires or buried in academic footnotes. But in the Harvard archives, in sealed vaults beneath the University of Vienna, and in the private collections of certain European families, their letters, notes, and grisly data still survive. And somewhere in the world, perhaps under new names, behind new masks, the Ashford sisters may have continued their work. Because as history has taught us, monsters don't always wear fangs or claws. Sometimes they wear habits and speak in prayers. The Ashford sisters had not merely disappeared, they had disappeared with chilling precision. Investigators discovered that long before Sarah Whitman's escape, the sisters had established false identities and safe houses across North America and Europe, clearly expecting the eventual exposure of their operation. Shipping records and financial transfers revealed that they had been smuggling equipment and documentation out of the convent for months, preparing for the moment their facade would collapse. The final tally of their crimes was staggering. Over the course of 21 years, the Ashford sisters had processed more than 600 women through their experimental treatment programs. Of these, approximately 250 women had been returned to their families labeled as cured, but all showed signs of cognitive damage consistent with invasive brain surgery. Another 50 were reported to have chosen permanent residence at the convent. In reality, no trace of these women was ever found. Investigators concluded that many had been murdered when they were considered unsuitable for release, their remains preserved for study or discarded when no longer useful. The remaining 200 victims were discovered throughout the convent's hidden chambers, preserved in chemicals, labeled, studied, and stored like anatomical specimens. These were not the tragic byproducts of failed experiments. The systematic nature of the preservation, the meticulous notes, and the long-term comparative studies suggest a methodical process. These women had been killed deliberately, their minds and bodies used to fuel an underground movement in unauthorized human experimentation. Even more unsettling was the scope of complexity. The investigation revealed a vast network of medical collaborators, unwitting academic institutions, and paid enablers. Dr. Hartwell pointed out the most visible accomplices. Other physicians had referred patients in exchange for privileged access to cutting-edge though illicit research. Postal workers, supply merchants, and even local government officials had been bribed to overlook or facilitate the sisters' activities. Prestigious universities across Europe and America had unknowingly incorporated the sisters' work into their medical curricula. Surgical techniques taught in Berlin, psychological theories discussed in Paris, neurosurgical protocols taught in Boston and Edinburgh. All were founded in part on data obtained through unspeakable human suffering in the forests of Maine. The revelations triggered an uncomfortable reckoning across the medical profession. Scholars and physicians were forced to ask, how much of what we consider progress is built on the foundation of moral catastrophe? But for the families of the victims, justice came at a terrible cost. To publicly acknowledge what had happened, admitted that their daughters' sisters' wives had been surgically mutilated, robbed of their minds, and in many cases their lives, while the community looked the other way. It would mean social ruin, public shame, and unending questions about their own role in the betrayal. And so many chose silence. A collective hush fell over the town of Millbridge and over every city that had once whispered rumors of miraculous cures for troubled women. The official investigation was quietly closed after just 6 months. Much of the evidence files, bodies correspondence, was sealed in federal archives, labeled as sensitive material and forgotten by design. It will remain untouched for over a century. The official record closes the case with a single line. 3 women operating a fraudulent medical facility had fled justice, leaving behind evidence of irregular treatment methods. No further names were published, no held trials, and no real justice delivered. In time, the convent building was burned to the ground by local residents, some motivated by outrage, others by shame. They chose that by reducing its stones to ash, they could erase the memory of what had occurred within. But the past cannot be buried so easily. Although the sisters' crimes had been horrific, their research was preserved, copied, and distributed among medical institutions across Europe and America. Ironically and disturbingly, knowledge gained through decades of torture, death, and psychological destruction contributed to legitimate scientific breakthroughs in the fields of neurology and psychiatry. What was once criminal became in time foundational. The Ashford sisters had illuminated dark corners of the human mind, but at a human cost that defies comprehension. At the heart of this harrowing legacy is Sarah Whitman, the lone survivor who had dared to expose the truth. She spent months testifying to investigators, identifying victims, and aiding in the documentation of the sisters' crimes. But the emotional toll was devastating. Society did not reward her bravery. It shunned it. Many found her story too horrifying to accept. Others simply wanted to forget. Sarah eventually left Maine, moving to California under an assumed name. There she lived quietly, working as a school teacher. She never married. Contact with her family was minimal. They, like the rest of society, prefer silence over shame. Before her death in 1863, Sarah wrote a memoir detailing her experience inside the convent of Eternal Tears. It will become the most complete first-hand account of the atrocities committed by the Ashford sisters and the linchpin of the historical record that survived official efforts to bury the truth. As for the sisters themselves, they were never captured. Unconfirmed sightings and whisper reports surfaced for decades. In 1847, a traveler said to have seen 3 elderly women operating a private medical facility in Argentina that catered to wealthy families. Nothing came of the investigation. The most credible account emerged in Paris in 1856, when a regarded French physician reported encountering a woman matching Dr. Agatha Brennan's description. She was working under an assumed name, treating women for nervous conditions, using suspiciously familiar techniques. By the time authorities arrived, she was gone. To this day, the Ashford sisters' ultimate fate remains a mystery. Whether they continued their work under new identities or were silenced by former associates, no one knows. But what they leave behind cannot be forgotten. The case of the Convent of Eternal Tears stands as one of the most disturbing and systematic examples of human experimentation in American history. It represents the grotesque collision of scientific ambition and moral collapse, a tale where advances in medicine were purchased with the lives and minds of hazardous women. Their crimes reveal more than just individual evil. They expose a society willing to look the other way, to label dissent as madness, and to allow the language of progress to justify unspeakable abuse. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the conspiracy of silence that followed their exposure, a collective refusal to face the consequences of what had been allowed to happen. The convent may be gone, but its shadows remain. The family's institutions and officials who chose silence over the truth ensure that the victim's suffering would fade into obscurity and that similar crimes could one day return hidden in plain sight. This story is not just a forgotten chapter of history, it is a warning. It shows us the terrifying consequences of unchecked scientific ambition, especially when paired with deep-seated social prejudice against society's most vulnerable. The fact that 3 women under the guise of holiness could orchestrate a systematic program of human experimentation for over 2 decades, all with the complicity or indifference of respected medical professionals and community leaders, is a stark reminder of how easily horror can wear the mask of progress. So what do you think? Could atrocities like these really have remained hidden in early American society? Does this story force us to question how many other truths have been quietly erased? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, could it happen again? Could similar crimes be unfolding today, cloaked in respectability, hidden behind institutional power disguised as innovation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story chilled you to the bone, make sure to like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you never miss another dark mystery. Share this video with someone who dares to look into the shadows of history, because there are still secrets buried beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. Join us in the next video where we'll reveal another forgotten truth that might just change the way you see the past forever.